Hello, I'm just going to provide a brief introduction to the kinds of evidence that we would like you to submit for your self-assessment process. Now, there are three key bits of advice here that we'd like to offer, and those are be clear, be concise, and be creative. So the three C's. So first of all, clarity. And what we mean here is that you might, for example, when you're claiming some of the in-lessons criteria, refer to the fact that your lesson plans exhibit that particular skill or attribute. And an example might be L9, which is diversity. So you can say, my lesson plans show that I value and exploit diversity within my classroom. But of course, that could mean lesson plans that sit within your IPDP, or it might be lesson plans that are held in paper copy at your place of work. So the first thing to do is to be clear about actually where those lesson plans are stored, so that if somebody wanted to check the evidence, they could go to the source and have a look at it. But also, it might be really useful to add a date for that. So if there are particular lesson plans that show the way in which you exploit diversity more fully, then you might want to give a date for that. Or if you've been observed and you've got a TP2 in which your centre tutor has commented on the fact that you've dealt with diversity and exploited it very well in that particular lesson, then you could say in the evidence column TP2 for the lesson observed on the 16th of January 2013. And that means that whoever is looking at your file can go actually to the bit of evidence that you're thinking of and check the match between what you've claimed and what you've actually done. So clarity, really important. Secondly is be concise. Now you'll notice when you begin to fill in the evidence column that it's relatively narrow, and that if you start to type a lot in that column, very quickly the table is going to become enormous. And that's difficult in terms of lots of scrolling, but also harder for whoever is looking at your portfolio to get a good, clear impression of the sorts of evidence that you are quoting. So try to be relatively concise, and also be concise in another way, which is to do with the amount of evidence that you submit to your IPDP. Most of your self-assessment claims should be based on the work that you're submitting anyway for your Cert-Ed or PGCE during the academic year. And you can imagine that it might be tempting to start to throw in lots and lots and lots of different kinds of evidence. But again, you then lose the coherence of your IPDP and it becomes too disparate and too large for somebody like an external examiner or a tutor or a mentor or an employer to really get to grips with what's actually there. So try to be concise. Thirdly, we'd really like to encourage you to be creative, and by this what we mean is different kinds of evidence that support your claim. Now we recognise that in the main it's going to be documentary evidence. It might be your reflective journals, and we're thinking of written reflective journals there. It might be your lesson plans and observation records. It might be the assignments that you submit, such as, for example, the Enabling and Assessing Learning assignment. And that's brilliant, and all of those are good, sound sources of evidence. But we'd also really like you to include some multimedia if you possibly can. So it might be a video similar to this one where you're actually talking to camera about your professional practice or reflecting on your practice in that way. Or it might be images or video or audio of your work with students. Do be careful about data protection issues. Make sure you get permissions from anybody if they're involved in the creation of those resources. But it can really help to give a good, clear, authentic impression of you and your practice if you have some actual footage or audio as part of your IPDP. So we'd really like you to try to do that if you possibly can. But again, remembering to be concise and not to include hours and hours of footage or too much evidence that's additional to the work that you're submitting in any case for your qualification. So those are the three key things: be concise, be clear, be creative. Now there's one last area that I'd like to mention before finishing, and that's around how to make a claim for the different levels. So when you look at the tables, you'll see that you can claim for standards met, good and outstanding. And the thing to point out here is that when you look at the outstanding criteria, sometimes they're really quite different from the ones that sit below them. They're generally along a theme, but new things come in at the outstanding level. And that means that in order to securely claim outstanding. What you have to do is make sure that you've already claimed good and standards met. Now, that's not to say that you can't fill in the outstanding column first, but remember that when you come to make a claim, you have to have met the good and the standards met criteria that sit below that particular outstanding criteria. So be clear, be concise, be creative, and be thorough as well. Make sure that you're keeping evidence at each of the levels in order to access the highest grades.